Hey guys, it's Nathan Wilson again. We're here to discuss yet another topic of the automotive world. Um, Today we're going to address a question: why are diesels not an enthusiast engine? Why do we not like them? Why is it such an exception and not a rule that they even enter the enthusiast market? So, kind of give a little bit of qualifications for this discussion. Currently doing school for mechanical engineering to kind of get more involved in the automotive industry and kind of engineer more engines into the automotive industry. And kind of a difficult topic. I've had a diverse group of cars in my life. None of them have been a diesel, quite frankly, and I'm gonna explain why none of them ever will be a diesel unless I get like a F450 King Ranch or something like that. Well, let's first of all start talking about what a diesel is versus a gasoline engine, because you really don't see them unless they're in an economy car or they're in a big truck. So we're going to talk about why they're used in big trucks and why they aren't really used for performance and etc. And once again, we're going to start talking about this. What we're going to try to talk about in this topic is more of the rules and not the exceptions. If you go on YouTube, you can find some very, very fast diesel trucks that put out a lot of power and are very fast by any standard. So what we're going to talk about is the rule more or less than the exception, and we'll address some of the exceptions. So first of all, let's talk about the differences, okay? The diesels are generally going to be a bigger motor. They generally are always iron. They are always iron block because they always run a higher compression. They run a higher compression ratio because they don't use spark to ignite the actual air fuel mix. What they do is that they use the compression to ignite the air fuel mix, and that's how you get power via diesel. Now these engines are generally always bigger. They are always turbocharged, and they are generally always heavier. So these engines produce excellent torque based on the way they make power. Since the way they make power is by combustion and not by ignition, the reason why they're able to make so much torque is because of that. Now, they generally use turbos. I couldn't tell you why they generally use turbos, but I can tell you that the diesels in the past that did not use turbos were terrible. They were stupid slow, more so slow than the diesels that do have turbos. Now let's talk about the gasoline engines. The gasoline engines can be made of either iron or aluminum. Most of the modern engines are made of aluminum for lightness standards. They use spark plugs. They use a less high compression ratio because they have an ignition system to ignite the air fuel mix and not the combustion that diesels use to ignite the air fuel mix. Now these engines are going to be generally smaller. They can come naturally aspirated, which means no turbo, no supercharger, or they can come turboed or supercharged for all that matters. So we have a little bit more flexibility on them. They're going to be a smaller displacement as a general rule, and these engines are going to be in a lot more vehicles than you can find the diesels in. Now let's start talking about the applications of diesels. Now you'll see semis, they have diesels, and let's kind of talk about some of the, before we talk about that, let's kind of talk about some of the properties of diesels. And there's all going to be properties in relative to the gasoline counterpart. So the diesels are not going to rev as high. They're just not. They're not going to have they're not going to have as wide a power band, and they're going to be, generally, they're going to always have more torque than they have horsepower. We're going to come to that very shortly. So we're going to talk about some of the applications. The big trucks have diesels. Why? Because they need a lot of torque, and it's not that you can't get a lot of torque from a gasoline motor. It's that the diesels are going to make that torque a lot sooner. They're going to make that torque sooner. Now they're not going to be able to maintain that torque as long, which is why the semis are going to have multiple gears inside of that transmission. So also, else we're going to find them in, we're going to find heavy duty trucks, and for the same reasons why we're going to find them in the semis. Now they're not going to have as many gears, but they're going to have a lot of torque to help get that load moving. And we're going to discuss the difference between torque and horsepower. We're going to do that later in the video. And now we're going to talk about the gasoline engine. The gasoline engine is going to be in a lot more vehicles. It's going to be in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can find a gasoline 1 liter turbo 3-banger all the way up to the Bugatti, which has a 16-cylinder quad turbocharged, anywhere from a 1,000 horsepower to 1,200 horsepower. But let's kind of stay in the middle range. We're going to start talking about gasoline engines are going to have they can either have more torque than horsepower. They can have more horsepower than torque. It just varies. They can come in different aspirations. They can be naturally aspirated. They can be turbocharged, as we've already discussed. Now let's kind of start comparing these engines, because why we're really trying to nail down is why enthusiasts aren't diesel gross type thing. Now, we're going to give credit where credit is due, and where credit is due is that the engineers lately have been able to get diesels to be less gross, if you will. They're more appealing now. The reason why is because they're a lot more refined, and we're going to use that word a lot. And refined meaning is that we're not noise, vibration, and harshness is a good way to describe refined. You know, diesels have always traditionally been noisy. They've always had a lot of vibration, and they always sounded harsh, like something was about to blow up underneath the hood, and it was just terrible. Now, diesel always produced a low end torque, which is awesome. You know, you want that. That's a great feeling. Um, but why enthusiasts don't like them is because of that reason. I mean, you get this, like, a lot of people think the black smoke thing is cool, and I'm just going to be here and tell you this is all preference, and I will be more than happy to tell you when something is a preference versus when something is a fact. But this is all preference. I cannot stand black smoke. What the heck is that doing? That is not doing. It is not cool to me. I mean, you know, Halloween, sure, you know, you got some smoke going, that's fine. But I mean, on the road, like, seriously, I don't find that cool. Now, let's kind of talk about because in America, diesels are really not really found in cars, and they're more found in trucks. And I'll tell you why they're found in trucks is because of that torque figure we talked about. You start talking about the current heavy duty pickup trucks, they're putting out over 800 pound-feet of torque, and they're very powerful, and they get loads moving, and they're able to tow 20-30,000 pounds, and that's a very good use. But let's start using an example in which cars. Let's use cars, because the reason I want to use cars is because you're able to get a lot more comparisons, a lot closer comparisons. Because in the trucks right now, I mean, let's use Ford for an example. The Power Stroke, you know, makes 400 horsepower, 800 pound-feet of torque as it stands right now. And the gasoline engine they offer is a 385 horsepower engine with like 401 pound-feet of torque. And the reason why that's not fair is because the 6.7 liters is not only bigger, but it's got two turbos boosting it at over 20 psi. And the 6.2 liter gas engine is smaller, and it doesn't have any turbos on it. So let's start using cars. Let's use cars, for example, and we're going to start talking about what you're going to feel in a diesel car versus what you're going to feel in a gasoline car. Now let's come to that torque versus horsepower type thing. Everybody's like, well, horsepower isn't really relevant to acceleration, and they're going to be very misguided. The reason being is because horsepower is what is basically how long this vehicle is going to be able to maintain its torque. Torque is directly responsible for acceleration, which is, most people will get that right. But horsepower is a really odd quantity, and we're learning about that more and more in physics as we go along. You start learning about moment of inertia, you start learning about, you know, radial acceleration, all this other stuff. Horsepower is very critical to how a vehicle is going to perform, because at the end of the day, what you're going to find is that in a diesel car, you're going to have that instant torque, and then what you're going to find is almost instantly after you feel that instant torque is that torque is you're gonna feel acceleration let up. That's because that the diesel engines, they don't produce a high amount of horsepower, and the reason why they don't produce a high amount of horsepower is because they don't rev that high because of the physical limitations of the diesel engine. And now that they don't rev that high, you're not going to get a lot of horsepower, and horsepower is going to be that way. Is going to basically tell you how long is that engine going to maintain its torque. What is that curve going to look like when you have I've ridden in a Duramax diesel before, which is in the high 700 foot-pound torque range and a little under 400 horsepower. And what you're going to feel in that thing is it had very strong initial acceleration, no doubt about it, very, very strong. And when you feel that acceleration, it pushes you in your seat, even in this heavy truck. And what you're going to feel after that, you know, you're going to have a very limited power band of when you're going to have that torque. And what you're going to notice is that diesel transmissions are very busy shifting. Semis, very busy shifting, because they simply do not maintain this torque over our rev band whatsoever. And it's really rather disappointing, because you're like, man, I want to feel this torque the whole time. I want to feel it. Go into the gasoline engine. The gasoline engines, you can get them to produce a crap ton of torque down low. You want to see some really torquey gasoline engines, go to Mercedes-Benz, for example. They're going to have a twin-turbo V12, a twin-turbo V8, and both of these motors produce an ungodly amount of torque. And not just that, but they maintain this torque over a very broad RPM range. You start, even in the naturally aspirated range, you can go to something like a Coyote V8 or an LS3 or something like that, and these engines are going to be making a stupid amount of low-end torque, and they're not only going to make that low-end torque, but they're going to hold this torque, they're going to maintain a high torque over a very broad RPM range. What is this going to feel like in the car? Well, what you're going to feel is a very strong initial acceleration, and you're not going to feel that acceleration let up until the driver shifts or the transmission shifts, and that acceleration is going to hit you right back in your butt as soon as that shift happens. And you're going to feel it. And we can use another example of BMW's twin turbo 4.4 liter V8, even in the M5, a state of tune of 575 horsepower with a competition package and well into the 500 pound-feet of torque. What you're going to feel is that engine is going to make peak torque at 1500 RPMs. And it's going to keep that torque well into the 5,000 RPM. Now, diesels, we're going to leave the European diesels out of it for a minute. But diesels, especially the American diesel, even most European diesels are not even going to rev to 5,000 RPMs. Period. They're just not. And the fact that the gasoline engine can maintain this stupid high torque of 500 pound-feet over a very broad RPM range is insane. This engine is a relentless pull. You're not going to feel turbo lag until the very, very top. I'm talking 7,200, and by then you're shifting. You're done with that gear. You're going to start a new gear. And this acceleration is why. Now, we're going to talk about the old school diesels. The old school diesels had terrible smoking issues. They sounded terrible, and I still think they sound terrible, but that's a preference. And the acceleration they produce in a strong diesel is underwhelming, to say the least, because you get that initial push and you just want it to keep pushing, and it's not. And it's going to shift, and you're going to feel that push. You're going to have a little bitty RPM band about this big. Semis generally idle at like 400, 300 RPMs, and their red line is maybe at generously 2,500 RPMs. So the RPM band is already this small, and then the fact that engines don't produce the full amount of power over their full RPM band just by the way the internal combustion engines work, it's even smaller when you consider how long you have your peak torque and when you reach your peak horsepower number. So when we the summary, why do we not like diesel engines? Because diesel engines do not produce their power or torque very long whatsoever. It's like kind of like a tease almost. They don't produce that. And also, in every single example of a car that offers a diesel engine geared for economy, or even some people even crazy enough to gear it towards performance, every single example, it is outperformed by its gasoline counterparts. Almost every single time it's outperformed by its gasoline counterparts, despite having a higher peak torque. Now let's do something. I challenge you to look at the dyno sheet, because this is what really is going to tell you what's going on here. The diesel is going to make a peak torque. It's going to go up. The diesel is going to have a pretty high torque, really low, and after that it's going to slope down, and it's going to go from like right here. It's going to stop. That's going to be the red line, and you're going to have to shift. You're going to have to do something. The gasoline, at least naturally aspirated, and we'll use that as because it's a more extreme example. That torque is going to ramp up. It's going to see a peak. It's going to maintain that peak. It's going to maintain that peak. It's going to keep maintaining that peak until right before red line, it's going to start dipping a little bit. But before it gets to red line, it has this whole peak torque. So the average area underneath that curve is greater, right? So it's greater underneath that whole curve, and that's allowing the car to accelerate longer, because torque is what accelerates the car. Now the horsepower is what's going to be able to maintain that torque, because horsepower by physics definition is the torque times the radial acceleration, which is the radial acceleration is the way the engine is going. So what you're going to be able to find, or in a more practical sense, RPM, torque times RPM. So what level of torque is it going to make at this RPM versus this RPM? And if you want to see a great example of this, I would challenge you to go drive an E60 M5. I love this car. I love it. You'll hear me talk about it a lot, but I would challenge you to drive it because its horsepower is high and its torque is relatively low. A 380 pound-feet is a lot of torque, but for that class of cars, it's not. I challenge you to drive that. I would challenge you to find a situation in which that engine is not going to accelerate that car. And the reason why you have a hard time finding a spot in which finding a dead spot in that engine is, first of all, transmission. But second of all, it's going to have 7 gears, and it's going to have very, very few, if any, dead spots. But second of all is the flexibility of this engine. Okay, this engine is so flexible, and it has such a flat torque curve over the RPM range that it doesn't have to be at its torque peak at 6,600 RPMs. It doesn't have to be at its torque peak up there, because the reason being is because it has that 500 horsepower number that ramps up so fast, so you have an average torque over the whole power band that's just insane. So just the last example, you're gonna find, we'll use we'll use let's say we'll use that motor. We're going to use that motor. We're going to use an average acceleration power band for a gasoline motor. It's going to be anywhere from 2,500 to maybe 4,500 RPMs if you're not in it all the way. And what you're going to find is that the torque numbers at those given RPMs, despite that they're not the peak torque numbers, what you're going to find is that those numbers, those RPM, that RPM band, it's going to be really close to that peak number. The reason being is because the average torque is going to be so close to that peak number because the power is so high. Let's go to diesel. Now, you're going to go, let's say you get a diesel 5 Series, or maybe no, let's use a truck because that's what most Americans are going to find their diesels in. You're going to find a truck, right? Now, you're going to have stuff like turbo lag, you're going to have stuff like all that stuff. Now, the newer the diesel, the more refined and the less of these issues you're going to find. But let's use it. Why are you not going to have, okay, so let's talk about, first of all, you're going to have a 3,500 RPM red line, and that's being very generous, okay? So from 0 to 3,500 RPMs, you're going to have about that much space for your engine operating range. Now, that's not the peak range, that's not the highest average range, okay, but that's going to be the range period. Now, peak torque is going to occur somewhere up here. It's going to be somewhere up here in the maybe low 1,000 range, maybe 1,500. But even if it's at 1,500, which is an extremely low RPM, you got to understand that's almost half the range of the whole engine period. So what you're going to have is you're going to have a relatively low horsepower, which means that it's not going to maintain this torque. After it reaches peak torque, it is not going to maintain that torque very long. So what you're going to have is you're going to hit that peak, and you're going to feel that acceleration let up. You're going to feel it let up until the transmission shifts and puts you back in that torque band, which may be from 1,500 to 2,500, which is only 1,000 RPMs. Until that engine puts you back in that torque band, you're not going to feel that strong acceleration until it shifts. And the average torque over the whole RPM band is going to be overall a lot less, because even though the peak is higher, that peak is going to look like this. This is really extreme, but it's going to look like this. So if you're on this side of the peak, you're not going to feel nothing. If you're on this side of the peak, you're not going to feel nothing. If you're on the peak or around the peak, you're going to feel it. Whereas a gasoline engine, the peak's going to be like this. So whether you're on this side of the peak, it doesn't matter, because you know why? Because it's really close to the peak. If you're on this side of the peak, it doesn't matter because you're really close to the peak still. Whereas a diesel, once again, this is very, very rough, and this is very, very extreme. But it's going to be like this. So if you're on this side of it, you're not going to feel nothing. If you're on this side of it, you're not going to feel anything. And that's why semis have very, very, very short gears, and a lot of them, because they're going to hit that peak. They're going to go a little bit past it. They're going to shift. They're going to be right here. They're going to go back. They're going to shift. They're going to go right here. They're going to over and over again. They're going to do that because the torque is what's going to move it. So why wouldn't they use a gas motor that produces a torque for a longer period of time? That's a good question. One of the properties of a gas motor, since it revs so much higher than a diesel motor, what's physically going on in the motor is happening so much faster, easily 2 times as fast as a diesel motor. It's happening so much faster that's 2 times the wear. This engine is moving way faster, and it's under a lot more, well, I wouldn't say more stress, because the diesels have very high compression, but the engine is under a lot of stress because it's producing this torque for a long time. It's like you're going to run, and you're having to produce this power to keep you accelerating, and you can't. And once you can't accelerate anymore, and it's hard to produce that power to keep accelerating, and the higher RPMs are going to mess with you. It's going to mess with bearing life. It's just the fact of stuff going on. It's a fact of friction. All this is going on in the gasoline motor. So there's been a long drawn out discussion about diesel versus gasoline, and we're going to talk about, and we're going to just kind of summarize here. Diesel, good. It's going to have a lot of power off the line. You're going to feel that power. You're going to like that power. A lot of torque. Second of all, it's going to be more efficient as a general rule over the gasoline engine. There's a bunch of reasons why, but we'll take that as true. The third thing that's good about it is that it's going to be reliable. It's going to last a long time because it's not revving that high. It's 3,500 is done. It's going to last longer. The parts aren't moving as fast, and it's just going to last longer. Cons. And these cons are getting better as we progress with time. But cons, very noisy. They always have this clicking sound because of the injectors. They're moving at thousands of PSI. As a general rule, they're not defined. They're just not refined driving experience because of that blunt torque in the beginning. You're like, yeah, it's awesome. And then it lets off. You're just kind of like, the acceleration kind of tapers off. It's kind of like, The second thing, they don't maintain their torque very long. So when you want to be so if you want something fast, you need something that's going to have a high torque all the time. The ideal fast engine is that you want to have an engine that produces a torque, and it's going to produce that torque over a long time, infinite time. Heck, you want that high torque, you want infinite torque for infinite time. That would be the fastest car ever. Okay, but since they don't have that, that's not you're not going to buy that. You're not going to buy that for speed. Gasoline engine. We're going to look at the pros. Pros. Excellent sounds. This is preference. Excellent sounds. You hear a V10, you hear a V12, even a V8, LS V8 sounds awesome. That's just my thing. They're going to produce a high power. They're going to have a high power relative to their diesel counterparts because why? Because of the way that they're made, the way that they're able to get air into the engine, and the overall way that they're made. So they're able to produce a torque, a higher average torque over a longer period of time, over a wider rev band. So you're going to get more speed out of it. And once again, this is all very general. 3. These engines are very, very widely known. Most people know how to work on them, etc. Gas, the fuel for these engines is a lot cheaper. So you have to kind of do some math to figure out, okay, well, how much better gas mileage does a diesel have to get for it to pay for its fuel? That's kind of some math you have to do. So the cons are, well, I don't really find any cons, to be honest with you. I mean, they don't last as long. That's obvious because you're revving the engine higher. They're producing more RPMs. It's going to be hot. It's going to be very hard on that engine, depending on how you drive it. The second thing, cons-wise, compared to the diesels. And you know what? I'm not going to say that because you can find a gasoline engine with a crap ton of torque, and you can find a gasoline engine with a crap ton of torque very early. So I'm not going to say that. But this has been a discussion as to why enthusiasts don't like diesels and why we prefer gasoline engines. Hopefully you're able to learn something, and if you think maybe I was unfair about something, maybe I need to read up on something a little bit more, feel free to leave something in the comments. Feel free to ask a question or anything like that. But this has been Nathan Wilson.